Hello, Brovs. We're back with So the Witch Won't Eat Me. Fantasy and the Child's Fair of Infanticide by Dorothy Bloch. I believe it's from 1978. Yes, 1978. And we begin with Chapter 1, which will be read in three parts because it's a pretty long chapter. So I'll be reading about 8 pages or so. Unless it goes quicker than I think, but usually my limit's about 30 minutes. Chapter 1. I don't like to think of myself as a giraffe. The fantasy of a 3-year-old girl. Any doubt we may have entertained concerning the extraordinary reliability of psychic processes dissolves as soon as we begin to investigate the methods a child devises to ensure his survival. Up to the moment he enters the analyst's office, the child is likely to have been more active than anyone else in providing a psychological framework to defend himself against terror. The most dramatic instance I have encountered of a child's response not merely to the parents' concealed wish for, but to what she experienced as an actual threat of infanticide occurred in the case of 3.5-year-old Ellie. She was not only afraid that her father wanted to kill her, but had no doubt that he actually would. She sought refuge in two defensive fantasies. In one, she perpetually had to flee a continually pursuing monster. In the other, as a baby or bratty child, she demonstrated repeatedly that she didn't deserve love. And finally, when all hope of winning it appeared lost, she sought death. Through the early intervention of psychoanalytic treatment, she succeeded in resolving these fantasies by the age of 5. When Ellie's parents first applied for psychoanalytic help, their major preoccupation was how to survive the next 24 hours under the scourge of her unpredictable behavior. She was their second daughter, the first having died in infancy, and her birth had ushered in 3.5 years of nightmare. All thought of having another child had been abandoned, as well as most other plans and hopes. By the time they made their first appointment, they had reached the end of their tether. It took 3 sessions for them to lay before me the details of their anguish and its history. They described themselves as prisoners in their own home, victims of screaming tantrums by night as well as by day. According to the father, if Ellie was balked, what the heck? All hell broke loose, I guess, balked her and her behavior. Curious phrasing. All hell broke loose. The mother's attempts to sew or write or read made her the target for any object Ellie had in hand. If the mother threatened to leave, Ellie responded by clinging and crying. She held on to infancy and insisted on being called baby. Her pacifier was a permanent fixture, and its recurring misplacement a major source of hysterics. It was during the night that disaster really struck. The initial phase of Ellie's sleep problem had been mastered by means of an alarm clock. When it went off, she accepted its signal and trotted off to bed without demurral. Her father then read her one of Grimm's fairy tales, and although at first they upset her, she gradually got used to them. Then, clutching her security blanket, her pacifier firmly in place, she could be counted on to withdraw into sleep for about 2 hours. Almost invariably, she then awoke screaming and frequently kept it up for 2 or more hours. The routine was then repeated. The neighbors, of course, were constantly disturbed, but it didn't matter how many times Ellie was smacked. Hey, we beat the shit out of her. She wouldn't go back to bed. She still kept it up. She also wet her bed constantly, and any attempt to awaken her in time inevitably met with more screaming. In addition, she frequently interrupted her parents' sleep with a demand to be fed. Her mother reported that she jumped violently and talked in her sleep and had nightmares. During the parents' first interview, the mother broke down and wept at the misery that had befallen them with Ellie's birth. The father presented the catastrophic situation with the kind of mystification that in the Middle Ages might have sought explanations in demonology or the science of the occult. He now came to psychoanalysis not out of any conviction of its healing powers, but simply out of despair. He was a short, stocky man in his middle 20s with thick, black, wavy hair and dark eyes. He was originally from Louisiana, but like his wife, had grown up in Detroit. He now lived on Long Island, where he was employed by a sales corporation with an international structure. He radiated intelligence and vitality, but his frequent smile underscored the tension that seemed to inform every nerve and muscle. He acknowledged being abrupt with Ellie and, in general, having extreme responses. He was always on edge, and sometimes the slightest thing could set him off. He was convinced that Ellie detested him and reported that as soon as he arrived home, she started on him. She tugged at his clothes sometimes until they tore, pulled his hair, pinched his behind, and refused to allow him to sit down. He generally responded by finally lambing her, which resulted in her bursting into tears, stretching out on the floor, and sobbing her heart out. The hell is lambing her? His involvement in Ellie's routine had started the moment she arrived home from the hospital. The mother was indisposed after the birth and found it difficult to function. Her severe ovarian difficulties continued to the present and frequently kept her in bed. She took a variety of painkillers, which very often produced a state of apathy and made starting the day a formidable problem. She was unusually attractive, dark haired and dark eyed like her husband, and capable of looking very beautiful. Her appearance, however, was usually a barometer of her state of feeling. Just a casual glance at her hair or her choice of costume was enough to establish whether she was in or out of a depression or just how deep it was. Despite Ellie's intolerable behavior with her parents, the mother described her as very adult, outgoing, sweet, generous, very good with other children, and beautifully behaved with strangers. Because of the mother's frequent indisposition, the father had continued to take over and to assume responsibility for Ellie's care. His role still included dressing and feeding her in the morning, feeding, bathing, and getting her to bed at night, and all the emergencies that invariably followed. The full impact of this arrangement on Ellie cannot be accurately assessed, however, without taking into account the interruptions caused by the father's frequent absences. His work would take him away from home for anywhere from a day to several weeks. His leaving always precipitated the depression in his wife, who then packed herself and Ellie off to her family, consisting of her father, mother, and two aunts. After his return, Ellie and her mother moved back home and he returned his duties. This constant shift in handling would have presented any child with a formidable task. With Ellie's particular situation, however, it guaranteed disaster. If one were to scour the globe, one could not find two more antithetical personalities than those of her father and mother. Where he was tense, she was relaxed. Where he was abrupt, she was gentle. His compulsiveness was matched by her permissiveness, his aggression by her passivity. The realm of feeling was unexplored terrain for him, whereas for her it was home. The grandmother also lived in terror of the possibly crippling effects of restraint and indulged Ellie's every whim. The contrast between Ellie's treatment in her father's absence and in his presence could therefore not have been greater. A regular devastating feature of Ellie's relationship with her father was the character of the reunion upon his return from a trip. Since he was always anxious to get back as soon as possible, he traveled at night, often arriving in the small hours of the morning. He then tiptoed into Ellie's room, usually left a present on her table, and then tiptoed out. He had no sooner fallen asleep, however, than he was shocked into wakefulness by her screaming for him. He invariably shot out like a bolt of lightning and let her have it. But much good did that do. Pardon. The neighbor was taking his garbage and interrupted me. He invariably shot out like a bolt of lightning and let her have it, but much good did that do. So basically, they were spanking the child every time it woke up and screamed, which shockingly had a negative result. His rest was completely ruined. Between Ellie's screaming and all his wife's troubles, he was really fed up. Although each parent blamed the other for the difficulties with Ellie, it had occurred to neither of them that the father's absences affected her in any way. His conviction that she detested him left no room for the possibility that she missed him, or that she might interpret his leaving as a sign of rejection, and the nature of his return as further proof that he did not love her. When I mentioned this possibility to him during his second session, it reduced him to speechlessness. He had also failed to draw any connection between his arrival home and his brief appearance in Ellie's room with her waking, although he had noted it happened every time. He marveled that she could feel his presence in her sleep. But it became clear that the hard time she gave him was nothing compared to the hard time he and his wife gave her. He was quite overwhelmed. His own childhood had been so deprived that he had never guessed his love could be a central issue for Ellie. After my preliminary interviews with Ellie's parents, I realized there would be nothing routine in my treatment of her, but I was unprepared for the dimensions of the drama that unfolded. I've come to recognize the importance of learning every possible detail of the history of the patient, particularly in work with children. If one is to comprehend the meaning of their verbalizations, their fantasies, and their play, the child unconsciously designs his communications so that they may not be understood. His fear of infanticide is apparently so intolerable to him, and his need to feel loved by his parents so overriding, that he devises whatever means he can to defend himself against his perception of their hostile and rejecting feelings and their power and that of his own helplessness. Not only does the fantastic image to which Klein refers seem to be very much a part of the child's emotional reality and a regular component of its mental life, but his use of a vast range of menacing figures reveals the child's profound investment in displacing his fear from his parents, in concealing and camouflaging their identity, and in hiding his perceptions. The closest analogy to the process of his thinking is the work of the dreamer, who is also concerned with concealing meaning, and to that end employs illusion, analogy, and symbolic representation. He condenses images and displaces references, derives devices also commonly used by the child. In a letter written as early as 1897 to his friend Flavius Felix, Freud presented the definition of what he considered to be the defensive function of fantasy. Fantasies arise, he wrote, from an unconscious combination of things experienced and heard, constructed for particular purposes. These purposes aim at making inaccessible the memory from which symptoms have been generated or may be generated. If we add perception and feeling to memory, we have a working definition of the defensive function of fantasy that accommodates the child's fear of infanticide. This ain't gonna hold it. Where fantasy flows freely, and if one is correctly oriented, there is little difficulty in understanding the communication. A basic premise is that fantasy is never divorced from reality. The important frame of reference in any fantasy is the particular world of the particular child. Out of this raw material will be woven the child's perception of his parents' feelings and his response to them, and a struggle to deal with these two components. Armed with the knowledge of the child's real world and his history, the analyst is able to enter that region of no dimension. Although the fantasies I have encountered are as varied as the specific worlds that produce them, I have found that they fall into recognizable categories that appear to reflect the intensity of the danger to which the child feels exposed. Until I am admitted, there are frequently two major elements: the child and the world. The world might be an abstraction of overwhelming power, danger, cruelty, insanity, or whatever quality represents the child's perception of his reality. Or it might be the opposite. The child might initially supply in fantasy all that is lacking in the real world and devote himself to a continuous idol. In extreme instances, he may create a utopian world that becomes his adopted home. Candyland, Teddy Bear Land, and Mouseland are a few whose geography I have come to know. A second important variable in his fantasy is his own identity. In varying degrees, depending on the intensity of the danger the child has experienced, he frequently transforms himself. He creates the illusion that he is shadowy or invisible, or he acts out his fantasy and then assumes an identity that shadows him with superpowers or a different sex. One 5.5-year-old sought refuge in the fantasy of a germ, microscopic but deadly. He inhabited an invisible empire that he explained was small enough to fit into the setting of his own ring, of his ring. Another child who appeared overwhelmed by his own murderous responses established a sense of safety by depersonalizing himself and endowing objects with his feelings. Some children created another identity inside themselves or peopled the world with allied spirits who could be summoned by imaginary telephones whenever danger became too threatening. After my sessions with Ellie's parents, I was so familiar with the material of her life that I had the startling sensation as I listened to her communications of having broken the sound barrier. Her thinking became so crystal clear that I felt as though I heard her through a system of simultaneous translation. In the course of 1.5 years, she was able to resolve her fantasy and to progress to direct verbalization, which culminated in a session of confrontation that was quite extraordinary for a 5-year-old. After my first encounter with her, I remember thinking of her as a cherub with a very deep voice. She was dark-haired, with dark, mischievous eyes, and an all-over roundness that immediately called to mind the paintings of Renaissance babies. After her parents' description, I was thoroughly surprised not only by her angelic appearance, but by the seeming directness with which she related to all objects of the playroom. Everything delighted her, and one by one she carted off puppets and animals to her mother in the waiting room, exclaiming, "Look, Mommy, a monkey!" or "Look at the sweet pussy cat," until she had run through all of them. Despite her seemingly normal appearance and behavior, however, I did have the immediate impression of a greater than usual pathology. Perhaps it was a kind of wariness that showed despite her impish smiles, or the quality of her voice, unusually full-throated, and at the same time fogged over as though it came from a great distance. Its huskiness seemed not quite natural, the result of an effort perhaps to be other than a little girl. The other arresting communication was verbal. After she had finished with the toys, she averted her face and stated very matter-of-factly, "I don't like to think of myself as a giraffe." That first simple, flat statement immediately mobilized all my attention, partly because of the tragic absurdity of such a preoccupation in an extraordinarily charming little girl, and partly because it corroborated my observation that children are quite ready and capable of verbalizing to any adult who will listen the major problem of their lives. This had happened in so many other instances that when I heard Ellie's statement, I received it as though I had expected it. Its form, however, was startling, and it took 3 sessions to understand it. "Why not?" I responded. "Because I don't like to," came the reply. My momentary hesitation was cut into by her insistent repetition. "I don't like to think of myself as a giraffe." I fumbled with it to no avail. By the second session, my pursuit of this theme elicited only the further information that her friend Mary thought of her as a giraffe, and more important, that giraffes don't bite. It was not until the following session, which took place on a Monday, that a light began to dawn. Ellie gaily announced as she entered, "I don't think of myself as a giraffe today." Acting on a hunch, I stated, "Your daddy was home yesterday." Ellie's beaming face confirmed the hunch and encouraged me to follow it up with, "You feel happy when your daddy is home." Another beaming assent and further daring, "When you feel happy, you don't think of yourself as a giraffe." Broad agreement. And the next step, you think of yourself as a giraffe when you are angry. And finally, you don't like it when you're angry. Although that was the last reference to the giraffe, it did not leave a vacuum. Soon after, while we were exploring the terrace, Ellie stopped before a few bricks that were laying loose on the ground. Pointing to a whole brick, she stated, "That's a mean monster." Then turning to a half brick, she added, "That's a baby monster." A short time later, she confronted me directly in the playroom with the same insistence that had introduced the giraffe. "Do you think I'm a monster?" she demanded. thrusting her tongue out as far as it would go, drawing the corners of her mouth down and screwing up her eyes. Then, more emphatically, "Do you?" It may be that my simple denial satisfied Ellie, but in any case, that ended any further mention of the monster identity. At 3.5, Ellie was already acutely aware of her fear of being killed, and of killing, and of her need to feel loved in order to survive, and she had found the exact identities that defended her against her fears and laid the groundwork for eventually being loved. Did I miss something, or was there no part about her saying, "I'm going to be killed"? For her purpose, she had initially chosen an animal from the Central Park Zoo that appeared huge enough to stand up to someone as imposing as her father, and that, she had been told, didn't bite. Like the baby monster fantasy that followed, the fantasy of the giraffe reflected the depreciated self-image that explained and justified her father's violence and hatred and held out the possibility of being loved as soon as she changed. In addition, the choice of a giraffe fulfilled the dual role of protecting her against her father's violence and her father against the rage that his violence had evoked in her. In its tonal quality, the question about whether she was a monster now brings to mind another question that Ellie asked of her mother some months later. A nagging problem in Ellie's treatment that remained unresolved was her mother's presence in the waiting room throughout her sessions. At first, I ascribed it entirely to the mother's need and Ellie's identification with it. At the beginning of treatment, no matter how carefully I had instructed the mother during my session with her, there was a later slip up that resulted in her having to remain in the waiting room. Either she informed Ellie that she would be leaving in a tone of voice that was calculated to inspire anxiety, or she slammed the door when she went out so that there was no ignoring either her message or her departure. It became clear, however, when the mother's reluctance to separate from Ellie became modified, that Ellie's alarm had its own foundations, which she explained very simply in response to my questioning during one session. "Why don't you want your mother to leave and pick you up later?" I asked. "I'm afraid she won't come back," she said matter-of-factly. "Doesn't she want you?" I asked. "No, she doesn't," Ellie answered with conviction. Would she be happy without you?" I pursued. "Yes," Ellie replied, and no amount of talking could change her position. As she was leaving, she asked her mother with the same insistence that had attempted to establish if she were a monster, but without the grimace. "Do you like me?" The mother was astounded. "Why, of course, darling, I love you," she assured Ellie, but it was some time before Ellie's behavior permitted that to be the mother's prevailing feeling, and before Ellie was convinced that it was. And that's going to be all for now, Brobs. Goodbye for now. Goodbye.